Thanks very much. Hi everyone. I'm Rob Schick, and I'm really happy to be here. I haven't been to a USAR since the one in Denmark. I was doing my postdoc in Scotland, so that was actually a very quick trip over. And I got to have some Arlsberg. Someone had done some homebrew there, which was super fun. So no beer for me yet, but I'm rocking the socks, so I'm excited to go. And for those of you who are new to the world of beaked whales, they're decidedly non-rectangular, and they're really cool, and you can tell your friends now that you've seen a picture of one. You'll see a movie of one in a second. I'm an ecologist. I spend most of my time staring at this computer here, not going out into the ocean. But I want to give you an idea for the kinds of work that I do, and this is a big team that I work on. And so what we do is a series of behavioral response studies. Well, that's one of the things I do. And we as humans, for better or for worse, are putting a lot of things into the ocean, and one of those things is sound. And we don't often think about it since we're visual creatures, but certainly most marine mammals make their living at depth and with their acoustics. So a lot of the goal of this project is try to figure out how animals are responding to, in this case, Navy sonar. So we're going to introduce that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what beaked whales look and sound like, and then kind of give you an idea of the types of data that we collect. And then we'll sort of talk through how we try to make some inference on these. OK, so that was my cue to remember to go here. Oh, no, it wasn't. There we go. OK, next slide. I'll get it. OK, so walk through the flow of what's going on here. So essentially, these are controlled exposure experiments. So essentially, we're doing kind of a dose response study. And so the idea is, as you go from your left to your right here, if I get that right, is we put a tag of some kind on the whale. And I don't have time to talk about a lot of the biotelemetry, but I'm happy to talk at length afterwards about that. But we put a tag on the whale, and that's doing some kind of telemetering of its activities, what it's doing in terms of movement, diving, vocalization in some cases. Allow the whale to return to baseline, and that baseline can be sort of hours to, in some cases, weeks. And then we conduct one of these CEs. And one of my colleagues likes to say, really, this is sort of a barely controlled exposure study, because you're out in the ocean, and there's a lot of things that have to come together. But we put sound into the ocean, either with one of these sort of deployable speakers. There are sound sources that's in the middle thing, and that can be off the side of a ship. This is Duke's research vessel on the left-hand side, or an actual Navy vessel as shown, one of these Aegis-class destroyers here. And then after the sound is on, we sort of wait some time and see what's happening, and recover the data. So a key factor in the recovery data for the stuff that I'm going to talk about mostly is that the connection is between the tag and a satellite. So we have to have that connection being made to be able to get the data back. There are tags that are just put on the suction cups, and those are amazing. But similarly, you have to get that data back, otherwise you just don't get anything. And we work really near the Gulf Stream, so if those types of tags come off, then they can end up back in Scotland, actually, and that's a drag. But one of the big goals is to essentially try to produce something like this. So getting back to trying to be good stewards of the ocean, we sort of want to do, from an environmental compliance standpoint, figure out, like, as sound is increasing in the ocean and the animals are getting sort of increasing doses, you want to assess what's the probability that their behavior has changed in some fashion. And so this is a big goal of what we're trying to do. And I'll come back to an early example of this. All right, I got out of whack here.
One right in front of us.
Yeah, that works.
Both are still here. Still here. Still here. These two still here.
So I love that.
Still here. These two are still here. These two are
super really cool.
here.
That's my
One right.
co-author Will Cioffi on that. And so let me show you now play for you what they sound like. I'll play 2 short clips here. Okay, so what you've just heard is the whale echolocating, trying to find its prey at depth. And now we'll hear sort of the next version of that. Super cool, right? I think that's so fun. And if you ever want to geek out more on, oh, no, I'm not even showing the right slide. But if you ever want to show or hear more data that website is DOSIT's, Discovery of Sound in the Sea. So I can put that up afterwards. Okay, so what is sort of, I can spend probably hours talking about this slide, which I realize I don't have, but I want to give you a feel for the types of data that we collect. And so on the top 3 rows here are 3 data streams worth about 2 weeks worth of data taken from one of these satellite tag data. So the top 2 rows are movement data, so these are latitude and longitude movements. And then in the middle row here, panel C, is 2 weeks worth of diving data. And so one thing I just want to get across to you is these are the deepest diving species in the world. So this is in meters, and this is an animal that's going regularly down to 1,100 and 1,200 meters in the ocean. And if you didn't remember from what I said at the start, they're air-breathing mammals, right? So they don't breathe. And so they're going down and making a living for upwards of an hour, in some cases longer than an hour. And what you just heard in that last sort of buzzing and clicking, they're actively foraging down there. So it's an amazing physiological feat that they can pull off. If we zoom in a little bit from the light blue down to this panel D, this is just showing the same data zoomed in a little bit more. And so this shows you this regular pattern that you typically see, where these short recovery dives followed by a really long deep dive. And that's where the animal is foraging at depth. And then we'll zoom in finally, and this is right around the CE, so the red dashed line is corresponding to when the sound was on. And so what you see if you're looking at panel D here is the diving behavior seems to change, right? You don't need some fancy statistics. You can sort of eyeball that and say, like, okay, that looks a little bit different in terms of what the animal is doing afterwards. And on the very bottom, this is an integral of the top 2. It's net squared displacement. So you can see that the animal is actually moving away from the sound. So this is one that sort of worked out perfectly. They don't all work like this, of course. Again, getting out to the barely controlled. But that's the idea. Okay, so we've seen the whales and we've seen the kinds of data that we collect with, or have collected. Now I'll sort of talk about how we've been using R to try to make sense of it all. One of the big things we need to do is to figure out how loud it was, right? If we want to build up that dose response curve, we need to know what the dose was. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. And then sort of looking at whether or not there was a change. So did that behavior change? And the director's cut version of this talk has a lot of talk on structured EDA, but that got cut for time. So I'll talk a little bit about movement modeling and then how we're doing some modeling of the dive cycles to assess changes. And then finally, as I promised, bring it all back to a dose response curve. Okay, so the first video I showed you was gorgeous and lovely and really clear. The last time I went out, it looked more like this. And the eagle eye among you will note that that's the whale there, right? So there's this teeny tiny little blow. And so it's just, they're really hard to study because they're up at the surface of the ocean for like 2 minutes and then they're down for an hour. And so Will, who you heard in the video, built a Shiny app, and this is actually deployed at sea. So we're on the boat right now. Well, we're not, but imagine we're on the shearwater. And basically what this is doing is this is talking to the VHF antenna on the tag. And so there's a big VHF receiver on the boat, and then when the tag is up and it's pinging, then this gives you an idea of the bearing to the whale and also the strength of that. So that can help us sort of orient and get closer to the whale, which with such a deep diving species is really helpful. Now, from the sound standpoint, this is not R. This is a Panoply. It's a lightweight net CDF viewer that I think was built at NASA, maybe at Goddard. But I use it a lot because I work with colleagues out at the Navy postgrad school who do all the sound propagation modeling. And the files are huge and sort of time-stamped and multi-depth layers. And this is a really nice, lightweight way to look at this. So to orient you, that's Cape Hatteras off North Carolina, where we are now. You can't quite see. And this is the 100-meter isobath. And so basically, you get really deep water out here in blue. Sound is a physical wave, of course. And when it encounters barriers like the ocean floor, it can't come up onto the shelf. And so that's what you see. So think of this bird's eye view, because we're going to look at a few different versions of this as I go throughout the talk. Getting back to your talk, if we use an SF objects, and these are all, the sound propagation model all comes as 361-degree radials. And so I need to sort of play around and do some data engineering to plop the whale onto these radials. I can do that, and if you remember those top 2 panels, I talked about the uncertainty. And so this is some estimate of the spatial uncertainty, and this is actually a good one. In some cases, it's a lot worse. And then we zoom in further, and you can see that of those 360, the whale's actually only sort of interacting in kind of a data space with about 17 of these radials. And so when we sort of summarize all of that data across the different slices through an hour-long CE, GG Ridges is getting a lot of love here in this conference so far. So this is what the distribution of sound looks like on the animal. So this is what we're sort of starting to use to build up that dose response curve. And it was actually really nice to see Hadley vibe coding Shiny app last night, because this was essentially vibe coded. Not entirely, but the first draft was anyway. And I'm going to swap my, well, maybe I'm not. That got it? Yeah, okay. And so this was something that like I sort of wanted to build, but I never really wanted to, because I never really wanted to, because I thought it would be a pain in the keister. And then actually, it was actually reasonably easy. And so we have all the different animals that we've tagged and followed, and we can sort of drop down and then look at one of those, and then the distribution of their distances and the sound will change, and then it's brushable. So one of the things we were trying to figure out was, well, if the animal's receiving this value of sound, where is it on the map? And so just as a quick way to do sort of EDA, it's not going to contribute to the paper, but it helps us to figure out what's going on in the data. Okay. That's that one. And then now we're going to look a little bit into the ocean, if you will. This is the bird's eye view that I talked about. We're visual creatures, and we live life at the surface. Whales spend the most of their time underneath it. And so it's easy to look at these data and this one to think like, oh, that's really where the whale is. But in reality, they can be down thousands of meters in some case in the ocean. And so I built another app. I won't jog back and forth to that. But the idea here now is to figure out, not only do we know how far it is away from the ship, but we can use the information off the tag of where it is in the water column to assemble this distribution of sound. And so you get a feel for just looking at this, how the sound is propagating through the ocean, and where the animal is in that water column can really drastically change your inference on how loud it is. We summarize all of them, and then this looks like this. Our target in the field is between 100 and 140 dB. The very first top one we did in 2017, we were cautious, and you can see the whales were farther away, so this is distance on your left and then aggregated sound on your right. The whales were kept at a farther distance away from the ship, and then the distribution of sounds is quite a bit lower as you go through there. And I'm excited to see Will's keynote tomorrow. My knowledge of targets is shallow, but I used it throughout this project, and it's been really helpful because there are a lot of different data pieces that need to come together. And so that's been a great package to use. Okay, so in changes in movement, so you recall back to the first data slide I showed where the animal after the exposure was sort of moving away from the ship. And so we wanted to be able to quantify that so that we come up with a way to say it's a 0 or a 1, the animal has moved or has not moved. We're using the ctmcmove package, which is a continuous time discrete space movement model package, something like that. Both movement model and package. And then also these fit as time varying coefficient models with MGCV. So on the left-hand side, this is an animal that we would say did not have response. So we're looking at 24 hours before and 24 hours after the exposure in the middle of the vertical line. And then conversely, this is an animal that we would say did have an exposure. So this would get scored a 1 in our sort of response, non-response table. Okay, in diving, this is data. I don't have results to show for you yet. This is work that we're doing right now. Stacy DeRuiter is my colleague at Calvin University, and she's working on these, building a series of hidden Markov models, but also hierarchical hidden Markov models to look at the dive cycle to see whether or not exposure to MFAS is triggering the animal to move into sort of an atypical dive cycle. And she has both built up and used a fairly diverse ecosystem of our packages to do that. Okay. Now I told you I'd get back to the dose response. So we have an idea of where the whales are, both in X, Y, and also in Z. And through the sort of data engineering with the sound propagation, we have an idea of how loud it was. Through the movement modeling, and hopefully soon to be through the dive modeling, we have an instance of whether or not the animal has responded. And then now we can fit a binomial response model, and this is done in JAGS. And there's two different versions of the receive level here, and this is something that we're actively working on to figure out which is sort of more meaningful to the animal. So our working hypothesis is that the animal's receiving the sonar as a predator threat. And so what they'll do is they'll dive to depth and they'll go quiet. And so that's the kind of response which is sensible if you're going to be eaten by a killer whale. If you can outdive them and sort of escape quietly, then that makes sense. And so we're using receive level in two different ways as a covariate. One is just the absolute RL that was recorded, all those sort of ridge plots, excuse me, that I talked about. And the other is sort of a signal to noise. So how much above the ambient? Because the ocean's a dynamic place, ambient's changing all the time, and we have measures of that that are also modeled. And so we can see how far above ambient did it have to be for the animal to trigger into one of these responses. And that looks to be about 30 dB above ambient. There's a little bit wider confidence intervals around that, but that seems to be the preferred model as opposed to just raw RL. Okay, last slide. We're in year 7 now of this project, and we're supposed to be going on 3 more years, I think. So it's really a huge project, and I'm lucky to sort of play a small but hopefully meaningful and helpful role in it. But I want to acknowledge all the people that go out in the field and do the analysis. It's funded by the US Navy, so acknowledge folks at the Navy, and then also the sort of coordination comes down through US Fleet Force. Funding is Fleet Forces, and the coordination is down through the Marine Species Monitoring Program. And Joel Bell is a fellow Duke grad, so shout out another Dookie. And 2 things, I can talk your ear off about any of this if you want to, so please see me afterwards or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to talk more. Thank you.